Hey, it's Beyond the Session, the show where we show you how much your therapist likes to talk. Or in the words of ChatGPT, unlock the therapist code and gain exclusive access to their unfiltered conversations. These are super brutal. We're continuing our two-part series on the art of self-discovery. In part one, we looked at the concept of self. What does it even mean? And this is an important introduction for part two, which focuses on self-regulation. Because how can we regulate ourselves if we don't know what our self is, where to find it, or how to hear from it? If you didn't catch that episode, it might be a good place to start. Today, we're exploring a dichotomy of good cop and bad cop techniques in self-regulation. What we mean by that is that some techniques are about self-kindness and self-compassion and really nurturing ourselves, while others are more about self-management and behavioral changes. Neither of those approaches is necessarily bad or wrong, and they both have a role, but we're going to explore both sides of self-regulation and how the good cop and bad cop techniques can kind of play together to benefit our mental health. I've got Andi Atkins with me today. She's a registered psychotherapist and a frequent guest on our show. Andi, I'm curious whether you guys ever use good cop, bad cop techniques in your home and what that looks like.
Yeah, I think with kids, it's important to always have that balance of good cop and bad cop, because there does need to be that sort of dynamic where they respect you as the parent and know that you are the authority figure and that you're there to take care of them. And depending on the age, the developmental level, it's definitely a good idea for there to be these clear expectations and consequences. And I think some of that can maybe speak to sort of the bad cop aspect of things. But it's equally important even within sort of these punishments, these consequences, if you will, to keep reinforcing that unconditional love. Mm-hmm. Kids can't self-regulate. I mean, babies, toddlers cannot self-regulate. They can only co-regulate with a parent.
Right.
So it can't just be about discipline. It needs to be about also expressing to them constantly, consistently, I love you. I just don't love the choices you're making right now.
Yes. This is not a parenting episode whatsoever, but I like the example of parenting because it kind of shows us how we can parent ourselves, right? Be a good cop or bad cop to ourselves, or even how in therapy, how we can use the good cop and bad cop analogy to approach our mental health from different angles.
For sure. I think it also speaks to the fact that neither the good cop or the bad cop really comes in isolation. Yes. Like you were saying, it's not like when we're setting goals and working on ourselves, even though maybe we have to be a little bit, I don't want to say hard on ourselves, but we're maybe pushing ourselves to do things that we're not always super excited about. But that is happening in the context of self-compassion.
Right. Absolutely. And in the parenting example, even when we have to, take things away from our kids or show discipline in some way, it's always coming from that heart of love, right? That's always behind it. So then the good cop, bad cop, they're not diametrically opposed. They're not polar opposites from each other. They kind of interplay with each other, and it's just different approaches to kind of get to where we need to go. There's a lot of self-hyphenated words, right? Self-compassion, self-worth, self-talk. And really those are just kind of pointing to the fact that there are ways that we deal with ourselves. There are ways that we speak to ourselves or manage ourselves. And some of those are really positive, kind words, positive psychology, and some of them are more behaviorally inclined, right? It's more about managing ourselves or self-control. So let's start with the good cop. How do you speak to clients who have a hard time being kind to themselves?
One of the simplest techniques, and I don't mean simple to say that it's easy, because for a lot of people it is not easy, but it is very straightforward and clients do tend to really respond to it. And I know when I had first heard of it, it definitely made a difference in my own self-talk. And that is to think about the way you would speak to a friend. So many of us are so much harder on ourselves, and we say things to ourselves either in our head or out loud that we would probably never dream of saying, even to our worst enemy. And we just do it all the time, right? It's hard to think that that doesn't have some sort of impact on the overall way that we feel and act and sort of experience ourselves in the world. So if you can't think of how to be nice to yourself, flip it on its head. Most people have a pretty good sense of how to support a friend and be empathetic.
Yeah.
So trying to just turn that around on ourselves a bit.
Yeah. Do you think some of the ways that we're unkind to ourselves, do you think it's always really ourself speaking, or is there times where it's someone else's voice almost in our head?
It's funny you ask that, because that's something I often ask clients in session. whose voice is that? Or, this is a theme that comes up a lot, or this is a very specific criticism that I've heard you mention of yourself. Has that been said to you? And sometimes it could be a parent or an ex-partner, a teacher, even anything like that. So unfortunately, we sometimes use that as almost evidence against ourselves to reinforce that negative self-talk and self-worth.
Sometimes people are cruel and unkind to us. And even if it's not intentional on their part, what they're saying is affecting us negatively. And we can then internalize that, and their thoughts then become our thoughts, which is unfair to ourselves. So then sometimes it's actually sitting with that and saying, whose voice am I really hearing right now? Is this the way I want to speak to myself? Or is this something someone else said to me? And how much is this worth to me?
Right. I was just going to say, asking, how is this serving me? I think a lot of people have the idea that, I need to be really hard on myself, mean to myself, strict to myself in order to get things done or in order to be a better person. But I mean, the evidence does not bear that out. The evidence bears out that being self-compassionate, which of course does not exclude still having goals and wanting to reflect on ourselves and make changes, actually helps to foster more healthy and sustainable change than just being rude to ourselves. So if we've been mean to ourselves for 20 or 30 or 40 years and it's not helping us, then maybe it's time to think about changing that.
Yeah. And it's a little like we spoke about in the last episode, is that sometimes, especially when it's someone else's voice that's kind of taken over, sometimes we've lost our sense of self. And, it takes a lot of work to kind of get that back. And a lot of that is just kindness work, kindness to ourselves. And, a lot of times our upbringing and our values and our ideals play into that too, because we might feel like it's selfish to do that, to spend that time on ourselves. That could just be a family ideal that we have, or a values ideal that we have.
Yeah, there's something to be said for reflecting on our values, including figuring out, are they serving us? Where did this come from? Is this something that was instilled in me by family or by an institution? Not that that necessarily makes it wrong, but it might not be consistent or congruent with our current adult self. Having self-compassion is also an important foundation for being able to do so much of the other self-reflection work, because without self-compassion, we are more scared to be vulnerable or to make mistakes or to maybe even look too closely at ourselves, because we are going to be hard on ourselves. But if we go into it with the attitude of, I am human, I am flawed, I have strengths, and I have challenges, that often liberates us somewhat to be able to delve a little bit more into that self-examination and introspection. Self-compassion makes it less scary to do self-reflection and self-work, because you're not as scared of what you might find, because you will greet it with empathy and openness.
Oh, I like that. How can self-compassion techniques in therapy help to reduce shame and increase your self-worth?
Well, part of being self-compassionate is also recognizing that we are all humans here and that we are all flawed, and we ourselves as individuals are not, there's no reason to think that we would be exempt from that. And many of us do have a lot of tolerance for the sort of foibles and errors and idiosyncrasies of others, but not so much for ourselves. Which, I mean, even if you want to look at it in a logical sense, it doesn't make any sense, right? To treat yourself differently as a human compared to somebody else.
Right. Although I think there's the aspect where we feel like we can actually control how we're treating ourselves or others, whereas we can't control other people.
Well, yeah, absolutely.
Maybe there's a bit of that going on. Can you speak a bit to strength-based techniques and how that might increase our self-worth, reduce our sense of shame?
Strength-based techniques come out of positive psychology, which is a movement within psychology that has become, it's really sort of germinated and become much more popular within the past few years. And it lends itself to psychotherapy quite well. I use a lot of strength-based techniques myself. And sometimes it's a matter of almost turning things on their head. For example, I'm often amazed by the coping mechanisms that clients have come up with, where maybe on the surface they're saying, this isn't the healthiest coping mechanism, or, it doesn't make sense, or it's really strange or something like that. But I genuinely admire the resourcefulness, the creativity, the resilience behind a lot of these techniques. So I really try to focus in on that when people come through the therapy door. It's not about being perfect or having a perfect life. It's about how are you managing within, like, you've made it this far.
Yeah,
You
exactly.
obviously have some strengths. You are doing something to get yourself here today.
Yeah.
So really, really trying to focus in on that and build off of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can remember when I was doing my training, we were looking at examples where, women had been assaulted, which is awful. But there's often this idea of the victim and the perpetrator. So then instead of allowing that woman to have strength, even in a situation where something awful is happening, we're always taking that strength away by calling it being a victim. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So
You're putting a
then,
lens on it.
right. So then instead, when you're speaking with someone who's gone through something like this, it might be, hey, how did you show strength in that moment? How did you resist? How did you fight back? And it might even be something that was happening internally. Like she's saying, hey, I hated it. I hated the person for doing it. And even that in itself is a strength. It's like, it wasn't giving in. It wasn't, falling over to whatever was happening.
Well, I think a lot of survivors of assault do blame themselves. And I mean, even though the most common reaction is to actually just freeze, right? You hear a lot of these survivors after saying, why didn't I fight back? Why didn't I, hit them or yell or something? And I want to remind those survivors and anybody who's listening for whom this might be relevant, that sometimes freezing is the best coping response you could possibly do, because you did that and you survived. So you're still here. Yeah. So it's common to blame yourself for that, but it's not a sign of weakness.
Yeah, exactly. So again, strength based, right? It's saying, even in those most like vulnerable moments, like how did you show strength? Mm-hmm. And obviously not everyone's experiencing this in such an extreme way, but even in cases where it's just like everyday problems that we're going through or everyday struggle, right? Strength base is saying to ourselves, I'm doing the best I can. I did the best I can in that scenario, right? Sometimes we're talking about our upbringing and maybe we have resentment for certain aspects of it. But then one way to kind of make peace with it is saying, hey, my parents were doing the best they could with what they had and the resources they had at that moment. So I can let them off the hook, or I can let myself off the hook for the way that I handled something, because I was working with the information I had at the time.
Absolutely. Looking at things in context is very important. We do that a lot in therapy.
Yeah.
Another example that just came to mind is I had a client who had a family member die recently after a really long struggle with mental health and addiction. And we were talking about the language around this, how people often make it seem like, oh, he succumbed to his illness or he lost the battle. And we were like, no, he survived 60, 70 years of living with these demons. I mean, of course, his death is very tragic, but it's not a failure, right? It's a victory for him to make it that far. So just flipping that on its head, I think is so important.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a similar case this year too. And it was going back and saying, again, not a failure, right? Like, look at how many things this person was able to achieve, even living with such a debilitating mental health condition, and all the good things they were able to achieve, and the people that they were able to influence positively. There is definitely like a strengths aspect to it, and it kind of helps us again make peace with what happened.
Well, I think with strengths as well, they're important in their own right for helping us sort of capitalize on our resources and live the life that we want to live and feel fulfilled. And they are also they can be a helpful entry point to looking at some of our weaknesses or our challenges, if you will. Often what we perceive as our weaknesses or what might manifest as problematic behavior in some way is a strength that is taken to an extreme. You see it all the time. Or, I mean, the opposite is true as well. A client is commenting, they feel like they failed at this task or they feel so weak because of it. But we work together to see how, even though that specific situation, maybe we want to adapt behavior for the future, it does come out of a place of having a lot of strength. Like somebody who, thinks that they're a doormat is also probably somebody who is very compassionate.
Yeah. And humble.
Exactly. And it's sort of figuring out where to lean into that compassion and humility and where to, for example, set boundaries, and then the boundaries and the compassion work together.
What are some techniques that we can use in therapy or just in life that can help us to facilitate self-expression, self-discovery, being able to understand ourselves better and understand whether we're going too far in certain aspects or not far enough in others.
So expressive arts are a really great avenue for this. Some people really love journaling. And I always throw out the disclaimer that for all the perfectionists out there, that journaling does not have to be in any way formal or full sentences or anything like that. Sometimes it's better to just get your thoughts out, whatever that looks like. Music, drawing, painting, sculpting, any sort of art, really. A big part of the value of this comes from having different parts of our brain activated. It makes me think of how there are many stroke survivors who have aphasia, meaning that they can't speak. But some of these people can still sing.
Yeah.
Because it is the left hemisphere of their brain, maybe, that is damaged, so their speech is affected. But music, well, it's kind of all over the brain, but also largely in the right hemisphere. So it's almost able to activate a similar skill in a different way. And they even do therapy with music and singing to help people regain their speech. So it's kind of a similar concept if you're looking at trying to access new parts of yourself. You know, maybe you can't put certain things into words, but by engaging in music or art or even just like free flow journaling, you know, as opposed to trying to articulate things, it really helps you access that different part of yourself and maybe even get you into a flow state too. It can be very therapeutic in and of itself.
Yeah. Or I've heard of music for Alzheimer's, and that's kind of a way of accessing the past, right? Like going back to a part of your brain that is remembering things. And I think there's just something so beautiful. It's not just looking at things from a different angle. It's actually trying to use a different side of our brain.
Yeah,
right?
it's really incredible.
It really is. Yeah. And I mean, not everyone's got an artistic bent to them, but some people just like to have good conversations, and that really stimulates their thought process. They like to sit around a campfire or something, or, you know, go out paddling or go hiking. There's different ways.
You can express yourself physically, for
exactly. Sure. Yeah. There's different ways. Or I don't know, like my dad likes to go and cut down trees. That's a really good reflection time for him, is when he's out cutting down trees and chopping up firewood. And it's just physical exertion that kind of allows that stress to be released so that you can really have those good quality thoughts.
And you make a good point about sort of needing that time to reflect. I think one of the big challenges with self-reflection and introspection in 2024 is, I mean, so many of us are just on our devices all the time. We're not having those, you know, I remember even being a kid, being on the school bus and being really bored sometimes.
Yeah.
But then sometimes I would end up daydreaming or, you know, just having all sorts of interesting thoughts and imaginations and self-reflections that I never would have had if I had access to, you know, a phone or a tablet, as sad as that is. So I really, really encourage people to also take dedicated time in your day that you were not on your device. Like a great example is if you're waiting, you know, in line at a grocery store or waiting for an appointment or something like that, challenge yourself to not pull out your phone. Challenge yourself to just sit there and be. It's very, it's not easy for everybody. It's very mindfulness based, which also lends itself a lot to this idea of self-reflection and expanding on our strengths, and maybe also identifying some areas that we want to make changes to.
And while your device is put away, maybe say hello to a stranger.
Yeah.
That's something we don't do anymore. And there's something about just like having, you know, interactions with strangers that sometimes it does, you know, spark a different side of us or a different thought process for us. I think of the most busy people I know, and they're literally commuting 2-3 hours a day. And like, I can't imagine having a life that's so scheduled and packed. But then also there's all this time that you're sitting in a car, right? And I know some of my friends, they've tried to make that really proactive. They're listening to podcasts or specific music, and they're trying to kind of regain that time and reclaim it so that they can, you know, be introspective more or just have more enjoyment in life, right? Like, don't just listen to the radio and get whatever song. Like, listen to something that's really meaningful to you or purposeful, right?
Exactly. Or don't just doom scroll, as they say these days, especially if you know, like many of us do, that I don't feel great after doing that for a while. And, you know, maybe learn something or read something that is going to have value after the fact, even if it's just to tweak a new thought in your brain.
Yeah. Let's flip over to the bad cop side of self-regulation, the part of us that sometimes we need to smarten up, right? Sometimes we're making choices that we're like, hey, this is hurting other people. It's hurting myself. I know it is. Or this isn't who I want to be. And how do we kind of rein that back a little bit? What are some different ways that we can go about doing that in therapy and at home?
There's an acronym, PLEASE, that kind of covers some of the foundational pieces of well-being. The PL is physical illness. I don't know why. I don't know why. P and the L are for physical illness. E is eat healthy. A is avoid mood altering substances. I should add unprescribed, because if you and your doctor have decided that you are best to be taking some sort of psychotropic medication, then please listen to your doctor and your pharmacist.
Yeah.
The S is for sleep, and the E is for exercise. Now, I mean, even within each of those things, can be a series of challenges and goals, but if you don't know where to start looking at those things, even within, a therapy session, that's always some of the first things that we touch on, because they can have such a huge impact, a ripple effect on all the other areas of your life.
Mm-hmm. And it's so easy to overlook that. I mean, in my own life, I know that the times where I have the most self-discipline, I actually feel the best, right? Even though it's like way harder to wake up on time or get all the jobs done in my house. We have to be reasonable with ourselves and on what our goals are, what we hope to accomplish in a day, how we hope to feel about ourselves. But I think sometimes it is when we are more disciplined, or not harder on ourselves, but keeping ourselves in check, I would say. Sometimes those are the times when we feel best about ourselves, or we feel the most productive or proactive in our mental health.
Yeah, and it usually will go along with those, maybe some good habits around nutrition, exercise, sleep, medication, that will then make it easier and more enjoyable to do the other. It's like an upward spiral.
Yeah, exactly. So then what are some therapy techniques? Like, I know DBT and CBT, they're kind of behaviorally based techniques in therapy. So then how do they kind of play into this management of ourselves?
A big one with CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, especially recently within my own practice, is exposure therapy. And that's kind of the idea that you need to keep sort of challenging yourself.
Yeah.
Even if it's in little ways, you need to keep pushing the walls away from yourself so that the world doesn't close in, especially with COVID. When we were forced to isolate, a lot of people, even people who never had sort of a problem with social anxiety before, have become socially anxious. And part of that is avoidance. Our brain looks at avoidance and says, oh, this is scary. Let's avoid it some more.
Yeah.
So a lot of the work that we do in therapy for this sort of thing, people who don't want to leave the house or don't want to go to social events or make phone calls, is exposure therapy, which is where we work together to sort of figure out incremental steps of getting out of your comfort zone. You don't want to go all in all at once, because that can actually make the anxiety worse, right? If somebody has a spider phobia and you throw them in a pit of spiders, that is not going to cure them by any stretch of the imagination, right? It's going to traumatize them. But maybe you can have them look at a picture of a spider and do some relaxation techniques.
Yep.
And then they become more comfortable with that and can slowly move on to something more challenging, whatever their goal is that is meaningful.
And I guess the idea here is that we can't only do the good cop techniques where we're only being kind to ourselves, because like you said, a lot of times being kind to ourselves means I don't have to do the things that are hard, the things that scare me, the things that I see as overwhelming in some way. And then we're just kind of protecting ourselves and sheltering ourselves from the world. But the reality is we want to be fully functioning, engaged members of society. We're part of a collective, right? And so then that's where the bad cop techniques, the exposure, sometimes we need to do some of that stuff. But then the balance is that we're doing it from a place of self-compassion, of saying, I don't want to be holed up in my hobbit hole for the rest of my life. I want to have friends. I want to have community. I want to be able to go shopping all by myself and not feel the way that makes me feel. So there's always kind of a back and forth that's going on, right? So the bad cop stuff, it's like the management of yourself. It's sometimes doing the hard work, we call it in therapy, of getting into the past a little bit, the things that have hurt. We always do that, like Andi said, from a place of relaxation first. And sometimes it takes months and months to be able to relax our bodies enough to kind of go into the hurts, right? But the reason that we keep coming back is because, our clients are feeling awful, and we as therapists don't want that for them. They don't want it for themselves. There is that desire to kind of overcome the adversity that's happened in our life, overcome our fears, overcome whatever sense of shame or failure or whatever, hangups we've had in our life. Like, we don't want to feel that way our whole life, right? We want to be able to get past it. And that's where some of the bad cop stuff, as uncomfortable as it is, that's where it comes into play. But we're doing it incrementally. We're doing it in bite-sized pieces in a way that it's not going to throw us off the rails completely. It's going to be manageable, and we're just going to do it one step at a time.
There's a story that comes to mind that I learned about when I was doing my master's internship. And the idea is that we are a bus driver and we're driving along doing our route that we have decided, and there's going to be passengers getting on and off. And those passengers are often take the form of emotions. And maybe some of them are difficult emotions. And maybe they are yelling at us to stop the bus or to turn left here, trying to make us act in a way that is not in accordance with our route that we want to do. And the idea there is to just accept that, okay, these guys are going to be on my bus. I can't necessarily do anything about it, but I am the driver and I'm going to keep driving this bus in the way that feels meaningful for me. And as much as I can, just accept the passengers. So some of what we're trying to do with these good cop, bad cop techniques is find that place where we are able to be the bus driver. We are in control. We have a sense of agency, regardless of sort of what we might be experiencing, what's going on in the bus.
Yep. Well, and back to the parenting analogy. If we're the parent driving the bus, I guess this might be getting convoluted, but depending on how we're reacting to those passengers that are yelling at us, right? If we're able to speak to them in a way that has some compassion, then maybe their voice is going to get a little quieter and it's not quite so hard to drive that bus.
Right. It's that balance piece again, right? We're not, manhandling them, trying to throw them off the bus. Yeah. It's not safe and it's not often that effective, but we don't need to necessarily fully ignore them. We can acknowledge that they're there and go with it.
Yeah. Well, it's like what I say to my kids when they're yelling and screaming at me, saying, hey, I hear what you're saying, but can you say it in a different way? Right? Like, you can still say, if you're upset, that's fine, but like, you're screaming in my ear and it's hurting me, or I'm literally driving right now and this is not safe. I'm hearing you and I'm hearing the emotion behind it. And let's work on finding the words to say that. Because sometimes, that kid or that part of us that's screaming doesn't know how to say it in a way that is really communicating what it needs to say. So it's just like giving that space, giving that platform to be heard and understood and recognized, but then taking it with a grain of salt at the end of the day and deciding whether or not it's going to serve our needs and what we want for ourselves. Andi, thanks so much for coming in, talking about self. It's such a huge topic. I mean, we're all kind of self-centered. We think about ourselves all the time. So being able to unpack and unwrap that is such a process. And we're only skimming the surface today. If you're listening and you have more questions about this, you want us to dig deeper into some of the things we've said, we would love for you to email us at resetberry@gmail.com. And thank you for listening.